Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I'm also the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media at RutgersCSRR and at RUCSRR. And if you find the Race and Rights podcast informative, share it with your friends, rate us, and please consider making a tax-deductible donation by going to our website, csrr.rutgers.edu, and press the donate button. And please give generously. In today's episode, Professor Mahmood Mamdani, who is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University, discusses his book, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. Colonial states and nation states have been mutually constructed through the politicization of religious and ethnic majorities at the expense of what Professor Mamdani frames as manufactured minorities. Professor Mamdani examines this destructive pattern from its origins in America, where genocide and reservation systems created permanent native minorities, to its adoption across continents, appearing in Nazi Germany, the formerly Allied nations, and contemporary conflicts from Israel to Sudan. Political violence demands political solutions rather than criminal justice approaches. And our guest is challenging the limitations inherent in legal frameworks like those attempted at Nuremberg. With permanent political identities of settler and native that continue to fuel cycles of violence worldwide, Professor Mamdani calls for a radical rethinking of political community based on common residence and the commitment to build a shared future. Professor Mamdani confronts the uncomfortable reality that the nation-state was itself born by colonialism. Let's hear what our distinguished guest has to say on a matter that helps us understand the origins and systemic inequalities built into settler colonial states.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to take this opportunity to discuss the central arguments in my most recent book. The book is called Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. It was published in 2020 by Harvard University Press. Neither Settler Nor Native is a book about the nation-state and about post-colonial modernity. The introduction opens with a discussion of the two phases of nation-state, non-liberal and liberal. The nation-state was born in Iberia in 1492. Its agenda was summed up by a single slogan: one country, one people, one religion. This state project set fire to relations between majority and minorities within its boundaries, setting in motion processes of ethnic cleansing, specifically of Muslims and Jews. There followed a century of religious wars in Europe. This was the first, the non-liberal phase in the making of the nation-state. The liberal solution to religious wars was reflected in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Two key components of the modern state were born at Westphalia: religious toleration at home and the reciprocal guarantee of sovereignty abroad. The liberal solution was put forward in John Locke's treatise on tolerance. Catholics can be tolerated if they renounce any political support of the Pope or of any power outside England. This is how Locke formulated the key tenet of the liberal theory of the nation-state. The liberal notion of the nation-state turned majority and minority into permanent political identities. Only the majority has sovereignty. The minority cannot participate in sovereignty. The notion of a sovereign majority alongside non-sovereign minorities was the original sin in the liberal theory of the nation-state. In this book, I explore the export of the notion of different kinds of citizens, sovereign and non-sovereign, from the US to South Africa and Nazi Germany, and finally to Israel. At the same time, the book explores the construction of an epistemological project that grounded the political distinction between sovereign and non-sovereign subjects in an epistemic and legal distinction. The distinction between religious groups was further developed into a civilizational difference between races and tribes. This is a book about the United States as a founding experience in modern colonialism. The first chapter explores the Indian reservation as the site where core institutions of modern colonialism were forged. It is also a book about extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation-state building in the post-colonies. Should we think of extreme violence as the consequence of a criminal project executed by individuals, no matter how numerous, following the criminal model popularized by Nuremberg and today upheld by the International Criminal Court? Or should we think of it as a political project, a notion born of the transition from apartheid in South Africa? What can we learn from the failure of denazification and the relative success of post-apartheid South Africa? Finally, the book asks, what is transportable in the South African experience? What does South Africa have to teach us? To answer this question, the last chapter takes a fresh look, a look through South African lenses at Israel-Palestine, the most intractable political problem in today's world. Now, in this talk, because it's only 30 minutes long, I'd like to comment on 4 issues. First, by taking the US as a case, I seek to compare the conquest of Indians and the domination of Africans to distinguish between colonial conquest and racial domination as 2 different modern ways of subjugation, each with a radical consequence. Second, I will ask, what is the difference between an immigrant and a settler? Third, I suggest we think of 2 different ways of thinking of political identity. One as historical and changeable, and the other as natural and permanent. To historicize identity is to see it as born of a particular form of the state, and therefore as changeable. But to see identity as natural and thus a permanent claim is to see it as a timeless expression of a trans-historical and innate cultural self. Finally, I suggest that we decouple the nation and the state as we seek an alternative to the nation-state. I shall begin with a discussion of American Indians and African Americans in the US. What's in a name? How should we call the pre-Columbian resident communities of the Americas? As Indian or as Native? The museum dedicated to pre-Columbian era in Washington, D.C. is called the National Museum of the American Indian. It's not called the National Museum of the Native Americans. What difference would it make if we were to call this museum the National Museum of the Native American and not the American Indian? Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations, so that a separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968? To be sure, the 2 acts are not the same. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, whereas the 1968 Indian Act is not. It is only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and have never been rights-bearing citizens of the U.S. in a constitutional sense. There were no reservations before the United States. The reservation was a creation of the United States. The reservation is geographically within the territory of the U.S., but it is a polity separate from the U.S. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants, they were settlers. What is the difference? Immigrants come to join existing polities, whether they seek equality or advantage in it. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the United States. In the words of Chief Justice John Marshall, writing in mid-19th century, reservations are, quote, domestic dependent colonies. The term Indian tribal sovereignty, another politically correct phrase, in fact masks colonial domination. Legally, reservation Indians are wards of Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any indirect rule colony in Africa. The Indian reservation was part of a two-state solution. The two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate, was Lincoln's contribution in the second half of the 19th century. Lincoln claimed to provide a permanent solution for Indians who had survived the genocide. Germany after Nuremberg also embraced a two-state solution. Instead of reintegrating Jews as equal citizens in a single state, as part of a one-state solution, post-Nazi Germany embraced the idea of a separate state for Jews after the Holocaust. The Nazi project may have been defeated militarily, but it survived politically. The two-state solution gave a longer lease to Nazism's political agenda. The latest version of the two-state solution is in Israel-Palestine. In contrast to South Africa, where the native population was subordinated, majority of the population in Israel was expelled outside its borders, as it had been in the U.S. when Indians were herded into reservations. America also originated the notion of differentiated citizenship, with only some participating in sovereignty. Until 1921, Indians were nationals but not citizens. After that, Indians had to be naturalized. They had first to be purged as members of Indian polities before they could become U.S. citizens. Colonized Indians and African slaves represent two different experiences in the modern era. Whereas their land was forcibly taken from the Indians, African slaves were forcibly taken from the land. Indians were colonized, Africans were enslaved and dominated racially. The consequences have been radically different. Reservation Indians have a different relationship to the U.S. from that of African Americans. Politically, Indians were governed in a protectorate as part of a two-state solution. African slaves were racially segregated within a one-state polity and governed in thousands of separate plantation regimes. The one-state solution provided a political frame for the development of the struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination. Even if it proceeded by fits and starts, sometimes receding, the one-state framework made possible the development of alliances, making for a general emancipatory struggle. In contrast, a two-state solution has imposed isolation on reservation Indians by forcing them to live in a separate political home, in effect a protectorate. Politically, a one-state solution is preferable to a two-state solution. The American model was exported to a number of places, among these South Africa, Germany, and Israel. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. Settlers studied the North American experience on how Indians were governed. Three key elements of governance were imported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. The starting fiction was that every tribe has a territorially contained homeland from time immemorial. The fiction of a homeland was actually a program to expel each tribe from the bulk of its historical lands. Second, it was claimed that every homeland has from time immemorial been administered by traditional authority, sanctioned by custom, and thus not subject to popular accountability. Finally, this traditional authority was said to have the right to enforce a customary law on the homeland. It was further claimed that custom had historical legitimacy since it has been there from time immemorial. South Africa was not the only one that learned from the US. So did Nazi Germany and Hitler. Hitler drew two lessons from the US. First, that genocide is doable and therefore thinkable. Second, there can be a second and third class citizenship, as of Puerto Ricans, African Americans, and Indian citizens after 1921. Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study American citizenship laws. This background preparation led to the drafting of Nuremberg laws. This learning process has been documented in some detail by the historian James Q. Whitman of Yale in his book, Hitler's American Model. Post-war denazification failed because the Allies shut their eyes to the political project that inspired and propelled Nazism. For Nazism was a striving for a purified nation-state, one that would go beyond containing and taming national minorities to expunging the nation of all minorities, and thus purifying the nation. How should we think of extreme violence? As criminal or political? I argue that Nuremberg failed to root out Nazism politically. Unlike the criminal model, which understands violence as the result of antisocial acts of individual perpetrators, I focus on extreme violence as an outcome of collective mobilization against minorities in the nation-state. Rather than individualize the violence as a standalone act, I point to cycles of violence sustained by groups mobilized as so many constituencies. Rather than catalog atrocities so as to name, shame, and punish its individual perpetrators, I ask to identify the issues around which constituencies are mobilized. Rather than exclude perpetrators from the political process, I seek to include them along with all those who survived: victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, and bystanders. The alternative to a one-state solution is two states, one for perpetrators, the other for victims. I use the term survivor differently from how it was used after the Holocaust or after the Rwandan genocide, not just to refer to surviving victims of extreme violence, but to refer to all who survived extreme violence. Are Jewish people in Israel settlers or immigrants? The Jewish population of Mandate Palestine belonged to three groups. First, there were those who had never left. These were among the natives of Palestine. Then there were those who returned on a pilgrimage seeking a religious homeland. They were content to be part of the existing polity. They did not have a separate political agenda. This was the first aliyah of immigrants. Finally, there were those who wanted their own exclusive polity, a Jewish nation-state in place of the existing polity. They came in the second and third aliyah. These were the settlers. Victims of the nation-state project in Germany and in Europe, Zionists decided to set up a nation-state in Eretz Israel. The Zionist state project has unfolded in two phases. The first reduced the Palestinians from a majority to a minority. This was the Nakba. The Zionist project has continued to demonize the minority that remained within its territorial boundaries as a demographic threat, demanding that their numbers be further cut down. In reality, the Nakba continues. Palestinians inside Israel do not participate in sovereignty. They have rights, even political rights, including the right to vote, but they do not participate in power. This vision has become clearer as the state project has been redefined, from Israel as a Jewish and democratic state to Israel as a Jewish state. I have already spelled out the significance of the debate on one-state versus two-state solution. One state would be akin to direct racial domination. whereas a two-state solution would create a colonial protectorate. The history of the African slave in America shows that a one-state solution is a better framework for building alliances and broadening the frame and depth of resistance. But to have a future, that resistance needs to look for a third alternative. I propose that we look at the South African transition from apartheid to glimpse this possibility. I argue that the anti-apartheid resistance took a creative turn in the 1970s, leading to an epistemological and political breakthrough for the anti-apartheid movement. Before the 1970s, the anti-apartheid policies were largely derivative. It reproduced the architecture of apartheid. Each racial group organized separately, as defined by apartheid power. Africans as African National Congress, Indians as Natal Indian Congress, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, and whites as Congress of Democrats. By reproducing the architecture of apartheid inside the resistance gave apartheid a natural flavor. The apartheid mindset was broken only in the 1970s. The key initiative came from the student movement, starting when black students, led by Biko, left the liberal white student organization, formed their own separate body, and went on to organize township dwellers, starting with Soweto. Left in the wilderness, radical white students turned to organizing hostel workers on the fringes of townships. Out of this experience was born an epistemological awakening that political identity is historical, not natural. Black, said Biko, is not a color. If you're oppressed, you're black. There was nothing inevitable about the impact of BC, black consciousness, on the anti-apartheid struggle. Black consciousness could have led to a nation-state consciousness, claiming that South Africa is a black nation, a nation of the black majority, thus essentializing black as a trans-historical identity. Instead, it led to an epistemological awakening, the consciousness of black as a historical political identity, one that was constructed by power and could be changed by a reform of power. Afrikaners made a journey from being junior partners of British colonialism to being part of the anti-apartheid coalition, but there was no consensus. The South African movement was born in the 70s and 80s. The anti-apartheid movement experienced a threefold shift in vision. From opposition, it looked for an alternative to apartheid. Rather than just turning the world upside down, it dared to think of a different world. From a state of the majority, the national majority, the black majority, it looked to create a state of all the people. From opposition to whites, it went on to oppose white power. The turning point was when anti-apartheid forces reformulated their demand from black majority rule to non-racial rule. Rather than deny the existence of race, they refused to endow it with a political significance. The next step would be detribalization. Central to it would be to de-link culture from territory, ethnicity from homeland, citizenship from identity. To do so would be to reverse the politicization of culture under apartheid through the creation of homelands, homeland authority and customary law. The result would be to create a single citizenship or a hierarchy of multiple citizenships based on separate identifications, race in the central state and tribe in the homelands. 1994 created formal political equality in South Africa, regardless of race. It is yet to create formal political equality in the former homelands, regardless of ethnic identity. My claim is that a successful struggle for social justice will need to cut across political divide imposed by race and tribe. Without political equality, the mobilization for social justice will be fragmented into so many separate races and tribes. 1994 was the birth of a new political community. Instead of a rupture into two separate communities, one of victims and the other of perpetrators, blacks and white, requiring a partition of South Africa. Let us not forget that in 1994, Afrikaners divided. with a minority asking for a homeland where Afrikaners would have their own state. The political community that did emerge in 1994 was that of survivors of apartheid. All survivors, whether victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, or bystanders. Apartheid power was not defeated, neither did it win. The solution in the mid-1980s could only be described as a stalemate. Why then did captains of apartheid agree to negotiate in 1990? Two considerations made them rethink their primary reliance on a military strategy. One, the possibility that anti-apartheid mobilization may spread from the townships to Bantustans. But more important was the likelihood of an even more scary outcome. Boers realized that the hitherto pro-apartheid Boer intelligentsia was gradually beginning to abandon apartheid as a state project, looking for an alternative. The principal critique of 1994 is that there was no social justice. This critique both states a truism and misses the significance of the political rebirth that did happen in 1994. I argue that we should see the rebirth as the beginning and not the end of decolonization. I turn to Israel-Palestine. We need to begin by de-exceptionalizing Zionism. At the core of political Zionism is the effort to build not just a Jewish religious community in the Holy Land, but a Jewish state. Political Zionism seeks to erase the distinction between state and society. The conflation of society with the state is the foundation of the nation-state and its program of rule by a permanent national majority. The nation-state may call itself a democracy, as Israel does, but this democracy is not actually determined through political contestation. Rather, the majority is defined pre-politically, as it is the nation itself. The most the majority can hope for is a democracy for the majority, but not for all. Not even majoritarian democracy remains a difficult project in Israel, because the state defines who can be a member of that majority. In other words, who is officially considered a Jew. This is amongst the most fundamental of Israel's unanswered questions. If Israel is to be a state for Jews only, it must answer the question, who is a Jew? Its answer cannot avoid flattening the diversity of world Jewry into the Jewry sanctioned by the state. At the legal level, this question has bedeviled Israeli authorities since the law of return was passed in 1950. Is a Jew defined by religion or by ethnicity, or both? As a result, the State of Israel now has two legal definitions of who is a Jew. The narrow definition provided by halacha, which is customary law, religious law, which Israel enforces in the sphere of personal affairs, and the broad definition in the amended law of return. At the political and social level, Judaization eliminates unacceptable forms of Jewishness. The acceptable form is associated with Ashkenazim, who trace their lineage to Yiddish-speaking parts of Europe. Ashkenazim were the founders of the state, who embraced the role of civilizers committed to bringing other Jews into line with the national ideal. In particular, Ashkenazim have sought to civilize Mizrahim. The Mizrahim are Arab Jews. Not only are they the majority among Jews in Israel, they also present a special challenge to Zionism. For Zionism presumes that Arab and Jewish identity are both incompatible and indelibly hostile towards one another. Otherwise, there would be no need for a Jewish state in the historic Palestine. Ashkenazi Israel has demanded of the Mizrahim that they renounce their Arab culture and embrace only their religion, Judaism. No wonder the Mizrahim have paid back by standing behind a religious Zionism that stands to the right of Ashkenazim, politically sidelining it. For the Mizrahim, there are not one, but two political enemies, not only Palestinians, but also Ashkenazi Israel. Let's take a look at the Palestinian resistance. In the Zionist worldview, Palestinians are Canaanites who never left home. They are squatters, not natives. With the return of the native after the Holocaust, the squatter must get out of the way and make room for the native civilized by 500 years in the West. The Palestinian resistance has led to multiple shifts in the Palestinian liberation movement. From an early focus on armed struggle and following the First and Second Intifada, Palestinian mobilization in Israel and the occupied territories has moved to a demand for political change. The goal has been to undo the Jewish state and replace it with a state of all its citizens. Israel's political response has been to fragment Palestinians into three disconnected groups: Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the occupied territories, now further, Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians in Gaza, and Palestinian refugees. The development of Palestinian consciousness straddling these groups has been an outcome of a protracted process whose focus and center of gravity have shifted radically over time, from exile to home and from an all-or-nothing demand for Israel's disintegration to a demand for involvement in the Israeli political process. Organizationally, this has involved a threefold transition. At first, displaced Palestinians looked to Arab frontline states to be their protectors and liberators. After these Arab states were defeated in 1967, Palestinians turned to the nascent and exile-led PLO, an armed resistance movement. In 1982, Israel went to war in Lebanon. The brainchild of Ariel Sharon, then the defense minister, the Lebanon war was in fact a total war against the Palestinians. The IDF deployed well over 120,000 troops for over 10 weeks. It was the country's largest mobilization since the 1973 war. According to the historian Rashid Khalidi, outgunned and overwhelmed, the PLO withdrew to Tunis. But while the PLO was defeated, Sharon's strategic objective remained unrealized. Instead, the war intended to suppress Palestinian resistance only stoked it further. With the exiled armed resistance smashed, the moment was ripe for political mobilization at home. The first Intifada of the late 1980s crystallized the internalization of Palestinian leadership, and with it a definitive rejection of the failed armed resistance championed by the external leadership with a mainly refugee base. Arafat made two crucial compromises at Oslo. First, he tacitly accepted settlements in the West Bank. Second, he explicitly accepted Israel's stranglehold over the economy and sovereignty of the occupied territories, even going as far as to agree that this stranglehold would persist in a future Palestinian state. The Second Intifada, beginning in 2000, brought together Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories into a single movement. Both intifadas responded to the failings of the official Palestine liberation movement led by the PLO. The second in particular reflected frustration over the PLO's capitulation to Zionism at the Oslo Accords of 1993 and the onward rush of settlements that followed it. The success of the Second Intifada led to mobilization under Balad, National Democratic Alliance, a political party then led by Azmi Bishara, a Palestinian member of the Knesset. On May 21, 2001, Bishara proposed a new basic law aimed at achieving rights for Palestinians as a national minority. In the months that followed, Bishara presented another bill countering the false claim that Israel is a democratic state. It did so by asking the Knesset to rewrite that assertion in its basic law and instead affirm that Israel is a state of all its citizens. Whereas Bishara's first bill sought equal rights for the national minority, now he was asking the Knesset explicitly to reject the idea that Israel is a nation-state, a state of the Jewish people, thereby negating the existence of both the national minority and the national majority. Over the past decade, Palestinian politics has moved from an engagement predominantly internal to one predominantly external. The internal engagement called for a state of all its citizens as a counter to the Zionist project for a Jewish state. The external engagement takes the form of an international boycott of the Israeli state and society under BDS. To the extent that BDS calls for a de-Zionization of the state of Israel, there is reason to give it enthusiastic and full support. But to the extent that BDS seeks to extend this boycott to Israeli society and not just to its Zionist sectors, there is reason to be critical. BDS needs to learn from the very experience it claims to build on. That is the South African divestment and boycott during apartheid. The main problem with blanket boycotts is that they embrace a mirror image of the nation-state framework, which collapses state and society into one. By themselves, international boycotts are incomplete. The strategy of isolating the state internationally needs to be aligned with a domestic strategy to win over forces that are either indifferent to or opposed to the Zionist state, so as to fragment its support base within society. What can BDS learn from the South African perspective? First, the anti-apartheid struggle was not directed from a single center, but from multiple centers. Not only did the struggle include multiple initiatives, they were sometimes contradictory. Take the example of the anti-apartheid boycott, which was directed from outside the country, and the internal political struggle which fought for the right of the oppressed majority to participate in the internal political process. Whereas the anti-apartheid boycott made no distinction between South African state and society, calling for a boycott of both. The internal political struggle proceeded by building alliances with all sectors of white society which did not openly and actively support the apartheid state. Second, whereas BDS can contribute to Israel's international isolation, something more is needed if a non-Zionist alternative is to bloom in Israel itself. Like in South Africa, that something else is epistemic, a revolution that will open the way to an epistemic revolution that will open the way to a political one. Phase 2 of the Palestinian moment will come when the same dynamic that leads to the unity of the oppressed also leads to undermining the unity of their oppressors, when it is not just the oppressed who seek political change, but also many of the current supporters of Zionist power. Getting there will require a new kind of political consciousness within Israel, a consciousness based on the recognition that the flourishing of Jews and Jewish life does not require a Zionist state. It is this South African lesson that needs to be driven home to Israelis, as many as possible, that Jews do not need to have a Jewish state to have a secure home in Israel-Palestine. This is also the lesson of Jewish life in New York City. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.